Nathaniel Oubre was 42 years old, and the one thing he had learned to trust above everything else was this: the work doesn't lie. People lie. Appearances lie. The stories someone tells about you at a dinner party, the version of you they carry in their head because it's convenient, that lies most of all. But the work, the soil turned at 5 in the morning, the rows that straighten out over weeks, the harvest that comes or doesn't come based entirely on what you put into the ground, that never lies. He had lived by that truth for 11 years on 40 acres outside Covington, Georgia. 40 acres of red clay and sweet potato fields, and a small greenhouse that smelled like wet earth and possibility. He had built it from a foreclosed property and borrowed equipment and more early mornings than he could count, and he had done it quietly, without announcing each step, without asking anyone to notice. His wife, Claudine, noticed something different. She noticed the mud on his boots when he came through the door. She noticed the calluses that had built up along the inside of his right hand from the grip of a cultivator. She noticed that at dinner parties, the ones her colleagues from Fairfield Capital held in Buckhead and Druid Hills, Nathaniel did not speak the language they spoke. He didn't trade names. He didn't perform certainty about markets. He sat with his wine and listened and occasionally smiled, and people read into that smile whatever they needed to read. What Claudine had decided to read, somewhere around year 6 of their marriage, was that the smile meant he was out of his depth, that he was simple, that the man she had married in a moment of what she privately called romantic idealism had turned out to be, in her own words to her colleague Sterling Vaughn, a very kind man with a very limited ceiling. Nathaniel heard her say it, a Tuesday in September 2 years before everything changed. He came in from the greenhouse through the side door, the one that opens into the kitchen hallway, and her voice was carrying through the half-open study door. A limited ceiling. He stood there long enough to be sure he had heard correctly, then walked back outside, sat on the back steps, and looked out at the field in the dark. He didn't feel small. That is the thing worth understanding about Nathaniel Oubre. Contempt has to find a foothold, and contempt only finds a foothold if some part of you agrees with it. He looked out at 40 acres and knew exactly what was there. What Claudine Oubre did not know, what she had never thought to ask about in 11 years of marriage, was that her husband's farm was not what it appeared to be on the surface. Nathaniel Oubre's family had grown sweet potatoes and sorghum outside Covington for 3 generations. His grandfather, a man named Hezekiah, who everyone in Newton County called Hez, had started with a mule and a hand plow. His father, Arthur, had grown it into something respectable, and then Arthur had done something quietly extraordinary. Over 20 years of small investments and careful silence, he had built an equity stake in an agricultural biotech company called Verdant Root Sciences, a company developing drought-resistant crop technology that the USDA had just selected 6 months before Arthur's death, for a federal commercialization grant worth $47 million. Arthur left it to Nathaniel in a handwritten note tucked inside a seed catalog. "This is yours now. Don't make noise. Let it grow." Nathaniel had done exactly that. He had added to it steadily, reinvesting revenue from the farm, taking meetings no one knew he was taking, sitting in rooms where people like Claudine's colleagues assumed he had wandered in by accident. By the time Claudine was promoted to senior managing director at Fairfield Capital, Nathaniel held 29% of Verdant Root Sciences. She didn't know. She had never asked what the drive into Atlanta twice a month was for. She assumed the greenhouse, or maybe a supplier. She had long since stopped asking, because she had already decided the answer would not interest her. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. Once we have built a story about someone, the mind begins filtering incoming information through that story, accepting what confirms it and quietly discarding what does not. Claudine had built a story about Nathaniel, and she had been filtering for 7 years. The meetings didn't fit, the knowledge didn't fit, so they disappeared. The invitation to the Verdant Root Sciences annual recognition dinner arrived in October. Printed card, heavy stock, addressed to Nathaniel personally. It sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days. Claudine picked it up once, noted the word sciences, and set it back down. The morning of the dinner, Nathaniel came downstairs dressed and ready. Dark charcoal suit, the one his father had bought him for a funeral, and that had waited in the back of his closet since. His father's watch on his wrist, simple, flat-faced, the kind of watch that doesn't announce itself. Claudine was in the kitchen when he came down. She looked at him and something crossed her face. Not unkindness exactly, but the particular brand of dismissal that lives just behind the eyes and doesn't always know it's showing. "You're not going to that dinner, are you? The science thing?" She was already turning back to her laptop. "Sterling is hosting clients tonight. I was going to bring you along, but honestly, Nate, these are people who talk a very specific language, and I don't want either of us in an uncomfortable position." He looked at her for a moment. "I'll see you tonight," he said. She was already reading something on her screen. She raised one hand in a small wave that meant she had stopped listening. He went out through the side door, drove his truck down the gravel road to the highway, and did not look in the rearview mirror. The Verdant Root Sciences Recognition Dinner was held that year at the Georgian Terrace on Peachtree Street, the kind of building that has been watching Atlanta change for a century from the same elegant vantage point. Vaulted ceilings, warm light, the particular hush of a room where the people inside know why they are there and are content about it. Nathaniel arrived at 7:30. He knew half the room. Not the way Claudine's colleagues knew rooms. Not by name-dropping and strategic positioning, but the quiet way of a man who has been showing up for years without needing anyone to take note of it. The woman at the reception table, Gwendolyn, had been at every dinner for 6 years. She hugged him. The head of the research division, a man named Dr. Amos Witten, came across the room and shook his hand for a long time without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. At a table near the center, reserved for the company's primary investors and board observers, there was a seat with a small card bearing Nathaniel's name. He sat down. A woman beside him, who introduced herself as a journalist from AgTech Quarterly, asked what he did. "I farm," he said. She waited for the rest. Sweet potatoes, mostly. Some sorghum. Greenhouse work in the off-season. "And your connection to Verdant Root?" He smiled the way he always smiled. "My father believed in it before anyone else did. I carried that forward." She wrote something in her notebook. The program began at 8:15. The CEO, a steady-voiced woman named Dr. Octavia Stiles, spoke for 10 minutes about the federal grant and what it would mean for food security in drought-affected regions. Then she said there was a recognition she wanted to make before the evening's main program. The kind, she said, that had been a long time coming. The foundation of this company is not technology. It is trust. And the trust that made Verdant Root possible was extended, years ago, by a man who asked for nothing in return except that we build something worth believing in. I would like to invite to this stage our largest individual shareholder, and the man whose family made this company's survival possible during its most uncertain years. Nathaniel Oubre. The room was quiet for a full 2 seconds. Then the applause began, and Nathaniel walked to the stage with the unhurried pace of a man who is not surprised by his own life. He stood at the microphone, looked out at the room, let the quiet hold. "My father grew up farming red clay with a mule and a belief that the land rewards patience. He taught me that the most important things you build are the ones you tend without an audience. Verdant Root Sciences is one of those things. I am grateful to Dr. Stiles and to this board for building something worth tending." He paused. "I am announcing tonight that I am increasing my stake in this company by 8%, bringing my total to 37% of outstanding shares. I am doing so because I believe what this company does matters for the next 50 years, not just the next fiscal quarter." A murmur moved through the room. Investors leaned toward each other. The journalist beside his empty chair wrote 2 lines and underlined one of them. I'm also announcing the establishment of the Oubre Agricultural Fellowship in partnership with Morehouse College and Fort Valley State University, providing full scholarships and farm residency programs for students from underserved rural communities in Georgia and Alabama. My grandfather started with a mule. I want someone else's grandson to start with a laboratory. The applause was the genuine kind. The kind that builds from the back of the room and arrives in waves. Dr. Steele shook his hand at the podium and held it a moment longer than protocol required. Nathaniel returned to his seat, and the dinner continued, and the journalist asked him 2 more questions, and he answered them simply, and the evening was, by every measure, exactly what he had built it to be. Claudine Oubre learned about it the next morning. Not from Nathaniel. From Sterling Vaughn, who had seen the AgTech Quarterly social post at 6 a.m. and texted her before she had poured her first cup of coffee. Did you know your husband owns 37% of a company with a $47M federal grant? This post is everywhere. She read it twice, set her phone down, picked it up, and read it again. Psychologists use the term schema collapse for this experience. The moment when the internal framework a person has constructed to understand their world becomes so irreconcilable with reality that the mind cannot hold both at once. Claudine's schema had been built over 7 years. It had a very specific load-bearing wall. Nathaniel is limited. That wall had just been removed. She drove to the farm that morning. He was already in the greenhouse when she pulled up, working a row of seedlings with a hand trowel, the same as every other morning. He looked up when she came in. He did not look surprised to see her. She stood in the doorway of the greenhouse, wearing the blazer she'd put on for work, and for a moment she didn't say anything because she was still building the sentences. Why didn't you tell me? He set the trowel down, stood. You decided what I was, he said, without anger. 7 years ago, maybe 8. You decided I was the ceiling, and you were the window. I didn't argue because the arguing wasn't the point. The work was the point. Nate, you told Sterling Vaughn I had a limited ceiling. Still no anger, just the flat surface of a man who has made peace with something. I heard you. I was coming in through the side door. The silence in the greenhouse was the kind that has weight. I didn't correct you, he said, because I wasn't building toward your opinion of me. I was building toward something else. There is a particular species of grief that arrives not from loss but from recognition, the sudden understanding of what you had and could not see. Claudine stood in the doorway of the greenhouse and felt it moving through her like cold water. Not dramatic, not loud, just cold and clarifying and completely without remedy. She had colleagues who respected her. She had a corner office with a view of Midtown. She had cultivated a life that looked, from the outside, like the life of a woman who knew exactly where she was going, and she had come home every night to a man who had been quietly building something extraordinary in the red clay of Newton County, and she had walked past it for 11 years, on her way to something she considered more important. I am sorry, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. He looked at her for a long moment, not unkindly. I know you are. He picked up the trowel, not as a dismissal, just because the seedlings needed attention, and that was the truth of the morning. She drove back to Atlanta, sat in the parking garage of her building for 22 minutes without getting out of the car. The months that followed were quiet in the way that things are quiet after something structural has shifted. Not peaceful exactly. More like the air after a storm, which is not the same as calm. Nathaniel filed for separation in November, not bitterly. He found a lawyer in Decatur who was straightforward and unhurried, and the process moved the way Nathaniel preferred things to move, without theater. He kept the farm. Claudine kept the Druid Hills house, which suited her in ways the farm never had and never would. The division was, by most measures, clean. What was harder to divide was the thing that couldn't be put in a legal document. The understanding that 11 years had moved in a direction neither of them had fully chosen, and that both of them, in different ways, had failed to interrupt. The Oubre Agricultural Fellowship launched in the spring. The first cohort was 14 students from towns in Georgia and Alabama where the median household income was less than $30,000 a year. 14 students who knew what red clay felt like and who had never been told that knowing that was an asset. Nathaniel taught the first session himself on a Tuesday morning, standing in the greenhouse in his work clothes. He showed them the seedling trays. He talked about soil composition and root structure and the patience required to let a thing develop at its own pace. He talked about his grandfather. He talked about the difference between growing something for an audience and growing something because the ground needs it. One student, a young woman from Bainbridge named Petra, raised her hand at the end of the session and asked him what the hardest part of farming was. He thought about it. Trusting the work when nobody's watching, he said. That's it. That's all of it. She wrote it in her notebook and underlined it twice. A few months before the first cohort graduated, Nathaniel was introduced by Dr. Witten to a soil scientist who was consulting on verdant roots field trials in southwest Georgia. Her name was Dr. Marguerite Fontenot. She was 40, precise in the way of people who spend their careers measuring things that don't forgive imprecision. And she had a directness that reminded him of no one he could immediately name. She arrived at the farm on a Wednesday afternoon to review his soil data and spent the first 40 minutes disagreeing with his nitrogen protocols in a way that was technically correct and also, he had to admit, a little bracing. "You're getting yield," she told him, standing at the edge of the east field with her clipboard, "but you're leaving something on the table." "What would you do differently?" she told him, at length, with specificity. He listened and didn't interrupt, which she noted. "You're not defensive," she said, as if this surprised her. "It's my farm," he said. "I want it to be right, not mine." She looked at him the way people look when they're revising an assessment they haven't quite finished making. "Come back Thursday," he said. "I want to try what you're describing, and I want someone who knows what they're looking at." She came back Thursday, and the Thursday after, and by February, they had worked through the entire East Field rotation plan and also gone to dinner twice at a Creole restaurant in Inman Park, where the red beans and rice were the kind that make a person quiet with appreciation, and the conversations had run longer than either of them had scheduled. She didn't ask about Claudine. She had heard the general outline. It travels in professional circles, a story like that. But she didn't bring it up because she understood the difference between what a person has been through and who a person is. The first is history. The second is character. She was interested in the second. What she saw instead was the man who arrived at the greenhouse before his fellowship students every morning, already working, so they would see from the first day that the person who funded the program was not above the soil. The man who called Petra's mother in Bainbridge after the girl's first difficult week, not to report, just to say she was doing well and to ask if the family needed anything. The man who, when asked at a fellowship dinner what success meant to him, set down his fork and looked at the table for a moment before saying, "I want to stand at Petra's farm in 30 years and know that something I built helped make it possible." Marguerite had looked at him across the table. "You are an unusual person," she said. "I don't think so," he said. "That," she said, "is the part that makes it true." There is a concept in positive psychology called post-ecstatic integration, the long, unglamorous process of absorbing an extraordinary event back into ordinary life. The gala, the recognition, the dissolution of a marriage, the establishment of something real and lasting. These are extraordinary events. But the texture of life is not made of extraordinary events. It is made of Tuesday mornings and soil samples and a student named Petra who has stopped being impatient with herself and started being curious instead. Nathaniel had always understood this. It was perhaps the most important thing the farm had taught him. Seasons do not hurry. Growth is not photogenic. The yield comes from the accumulated weight of 10,000 ordinary mornings. And there is no shortcut. Claudine had started seeing a therapist in Midtown. She had resisted it for 2 years, on the grounds that she processed things herself, which is the reason therapists hear most often from people who have not been processing things themselves. She was learning, slowly and at the cost of considerable comfort, to distinguish between ambition and fear, between choosing what she wanted and running from what she dreaded, between the performance of capability and the actual practice of it. Whether she would fully close that distance was a story still being written, but she had, finally, agreed to write it honestly. She sent Nathaniel a card in March, not long, 3 sentences. I built a story about you that let me not see you. I don't have a good excuse for that. I am trying to do better. He read it at the kitchen table in the farmhouse and held it in his hands for a while. Then he set it down on the stack of seed catalogs that had accumulated by the window and went back outside. He did not respond in writing, but he had always known what kind of man he was, and that man made a call the following month to the Bainbridge Hospital, where Claudine's mother, a woman who had been putting off a procedure she couldn't afford, had been quietly moved up the scheduling list through a patient assistance fund Nathaniel had established through his accountant 6 months earlier. He hadn't mentioned it to Claudine. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. That is not a story for applause. It is just what he did. On an October afternoon in Covington, 13 months after the dinner at the Georgian Terrace, Nathaniel Oubre was standing in the greenhouse with the second fellowship cohort. 22 students this time, the waiting list for the third cohort already climbing past 100 names. He was walking them through nutrient cycling in a low-water growing system, and a young man from Selma named Dorian kept asking the kind of questions that required actual answers, not the performed patience of someone going through motions. Nathaniel gave him actual answers. Afterward, when the students had gone, Marguerite came in through the door from the east field, soil on her boots, and a clipboard in her hand, and they stood at the work table together and reviewed the data from the latest trial plot, and she said something about the potassium levels, and he disagreed with her assessment, and she said, "Show me," and he did, and she said he was probably right, which she said the way a person says it when they mean it. He drove home that evening on the county road that runs along the edge of the property, the fields on his left going amber in the October light. And he thought about his grandfather, who had never owned a car and had never met anyone from Morehouse College and had died leaving behind 40 acres, and a belief that if you put good work into the ground, it comes back. He thought about Petra, who had called last week to say she had been accepted to a soil science program at Fort Valley State and wanted to come back to the farm over winter break to work on something she was developing with her professor. He thought about Dorian's questions and the way a mind engages when it encounters something real. He pulled into the gravel drive, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet of the truck cab. The farm was the same as it had always been. The greenhouse lights were still on. The oaks along the fence line had gone fully amber. A neighbor's dog was barking at something in the distance. He was not the same as he had always been, but the difference was not the kind that shows on the outside. It was the kind that happens when a person stops waiting to be recognized and starts recognizing himself. That is a quiet kind of change. It does not make good headlines. It does not arrive all at once. It comes the way a harvest comes. Slowly, from the ground up, from work put in on mornings when nobody was watching and nobody needed to know. His father had told him once, the winter before he died, that the most dangerous thing a man can do is build his life for an audience. They'll leave, Arthur had said. Audiences always leave. Build for the work. Build for the people who need what you're growing. That's the only thing that holds. Nathaniel had carried that with him through 11 years of a marriage that could not finally hold the weight of what he was, through the slow revelation of what he had built and what it meant, through the dissolution and the fellowship and the Tuesday mornings and Marguerite's corrections and Petra's questions and Dorian's mind and the 40 acres that had outlasted everything anyone had ever assumed about them. A man who builds quietly never has to explain himself loudly. His father had not said that exactly, but he had lived it, and Nathaniel had learned it the same way he had learned everything that mattered, not from a speech, not from a moment of recognition in a room full of people, but from the ground up, one ordinary day at a time, in the particular silence of work that does not need anyone watching to know its own worth.